Now, it is the fundamental debate in this country and across Europe. Is austerity bringing massive government borrowing under control? Or is it simply pushing us further into recession? Here, bad industrial production figures suggest the British economy is now very close to triple-dip recession. Despite this, the government insists cuts are the only option. In a moment, the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman, who's become one of the world's leading critics of this approach, we'll debate with the Government Minister Matthew Hancock. But first, some background from our economics editor, Faisal Islam.
Thanks, Chris. Across Europe, there's been a continent-wide experiment in austerity taking place for the past 3 years. The True Believers says it's cut ballooning government deficits and kept borrowing rates low. Critics like Paul Krugman say it's just made a bad situation worse by choking off fragile post-crisis demand. Here in the UK, today's awful industrial production figures play to the fears of those austerity critics. A shock fall in industrial output in January by 1.2%, part of that down to North Sea oil platforms shutting for maintenance. But manufacturing is flat too. It means production is now at its lowest level since May 1992, more than 20 years ago. An official return to recession, the so-called triple dip, is now very much on the cards. The bigger picture since Britain's austerity experiment began is one of stagnation. Here's how the official government forecasts for British recovery back in June 2010 when the coalition took power. There's the recession and here's the strong recovery predicted under the coalition's original tough medicine. But here's what actually happened. Output more or less flat for nearly 3 years. The difference, about 4% of national economic output. That's how much smaller the economy has turned out to be. A recovery has never been so sluggish in Britain, and this hasn't happened in the US, Germany, and all other major economies. The timing of the flattening is also uncanny. Mid-2010, the question, how much of a role did the coalition package of spending cuts and tax rises play in this line? Last week, David Cameron claimed none, but his own budget watchdog wrote to him to disagree. Of course, a far bigger experiment in austerity has been taking place in the Eurozone, in Greece, under a programme of huge upfront cuts designed by the EU IMF-led Troika. Again, the results have gone way off course. Back in 2010, the Greek economy was expected to shrink by a mere 5% over 3 years as the cuts programme demanded by the European Union was implemented. So far, it's actually fallen by 17% and will carry on shrinking this year. Spain's testing of the austerity approach is also worsening enormous social problems. Unemployment's now over 6 million. 56% of young people now out of work. And similar pictures emerge in Greece and to some degree Ireland. The argument is erupting around Europe, and in the US, Paul Krugman says the advocates of more austerity in Europe are, quote, petulant and delusional and are pursuing cockroach policies, meaning ideas that were flushed away in the past but they keep on coming back. But the Troika says it stabilised the patience, delivered much lower government borrowing costs. Today, leading EU Commissioner Olli Rehn hit back against Krugman, telling him he was saying modified truths. Right now might be the last opportunity to take stock. Britain's set for more disappointing budget numbers next week and has lost that AAA rating for the first time. Some European leaders are pushing to water down the austerity drive at a summit on Thursday. The experiment, Chris, is far from proven.
Thanks, Faisal. Well, with me in the studio now is the Conservative Business Minister Matthew Hancock. From Princeton, we're joined by the Nobel Prize-winning economist Paul Krugman. The updated paperback version of his book, End This Depression Now, has just been published here. And from Strasbourg, we're joined by the former Belgian Prime Minister and now leader of the Alliance of Liberals and Democrats for Europe, Guy Verhofstadt. And Paul Krugman, we'll come to the British debate specifically in a moment, but let's concentrate on the European one first. Where do you believe Europe is heading if it carries on with its austerity policies and under the leadership of the man you've been baiting in your columns, Olli Rehn?
Well, I think it's very frightening. I mean, what's happened now is Mario Draghi, by stepping into the capital markets, has headed off what might have been a very drastic financial collapse. But the real economies are still deteriorating. Unemployment is still rising. There's incredible social, cultural, political strain in a lot of Europe. And at some point, it's going to crack. I mean, the Italian elections were a real warning that you cannot go down this course. This attempt to sort of suffer your way out of the European crisis is threatening a catastrophic breakup of all that the Europeans have worked on for a couple of generations now. So it's a terrible, terrible scene.
Guy Verhofstadt, you, I suppose, like the European Commissioner, Olli Rehn, are what Paul Krugman would call the face of denialism.
Well, I think what's absolutely necessary is that we continue with fiscal discipline. Otherwise, if you don't continue with fiscal discipline, you cannot guarantee your growth on the midterm and the long term. But I agree with Paul Krugman that at the same time you need also a policy of growth, of investment, of, I should say, of solidarity. And that is what we don't have for the moment inside the Union. And what needs to be done is very clear. The problem for countries like Italy and Spain for the moment is that they are paying a far too high interest rate on their debt. So in my opinion, a mutualization of debt can lower the interest rates for countries like Spain and Italy and can be the balloon of oxygen that they need for their growth and their investment.
Paul Krugman, does that make sense?
Well, it helps. I would like the European Central Bank to be doing even more. The mutualization of debt, look, it's not going to happen. I would love to see it, but it's not going to happen. What you really need is you need some relaxation of the austerity. Nobody is saying that you're going to go back to free spending in Greece. You know, no one is saying that you can completely ignore the budget issues, but at this point, does an extra 3 points of GDP of contraction do anything positive? Does it actually accelerate the pace at which the competitiveness of Spanish industry improves? Does it do anything except push the social stresses to the breaking point? At the same time, you have to have a very strong reflationary policy. The ECB should be doing much more expansionary policy. Germany should not be engaging in austerity at the same time that the Southern Europeans are. That's turning this into a race to the bottom. So it's what's happened is that Europe has tried to solve this entirely through suffering, through contraction, and they don't have that much time left. I mean, nobody knows how far it can go. But again, as I said, those elections in Italy, the rise of radical political movements all through Southern Europe, that's a real, that should be a warning sign. And I'm amazed at the complete unwillingness of the European Commission to admit that this is not working as it was supposed to.
Mr. Verhofstadt, can you hear us?
Yeah, I can hear you. Maybe I can give one figure to show that the mutualization of debt is clearly the solution. To combine fiscal discipline with a policy of more growth and more investment. Take, for example, Italy. Italy has a debt for the moment, as you know, of 2 trillion. If you can lower their interest rates, for example, with 1%, then they are gaining 20 billion euros. With this 20 billion euros, you can launch a policy of investment and of growth. And that's clearly what we need now. What we need now is more liquidity in the bond markets by a mutualization of debt, lowering interest rates for all countries in Europe and mainly for the countries in the south of Europe. And the difference can be the game changer in the sense of real investment and real growth in these different economies in the south of Europe.
Okay, Mr. Verhofstadt, thank you very much for now. Let's get to the British debate and bring in the Government Minister, Matthew Hancock. You wrote an article in September 2010 saying stick to Plan A and the growth will follow. When's it going to follow?
Well, that article was written, the headline is always written by the headline writers, isn't it, rather than you. But my argument there was that we have to deal with our debts in a way that is as supportive of growth as possible. And it's clear that you have to deal with your debts. You know, the argument that was just being made about the impact in Europe was also an argument for monetary activism, for low interest rates, which thankfully we've got here. And what I was interested in the slides that you put up, because you put up the slides on GDP growth, and you mentioned in the industrial production figures that part of that's due to North Sea oil coming down. But you didn't show for Britain the fact that unemployment is now lower than in the States, lower than in Europe, and that we have a record number of jobs. and that actually, if you look at, we've had a sharp decline in North Sea oil production in the financial sector, and that, if you take that off GDP, it has a very different picture. So my argument is that you need to deal with your debts as an economy. It's vital, and at the same time have monetary support. There have been things that have, made things more difficult, but the deficit's a quarter down and we're on the way.
Paul Krugman, you've been writing about Osbornia, and you've been scathing about David Cameron and George Osborne. I mean, can you explain to...
Use that as a hypothetical name for a country that somehow looks a fair bit like the UK. So look, first of all, those employment numbers, I'm not in the UK, and even I know that there's some very funny stuff. There's a lot of self-employed. There's a lot of very low productivity jobs. Those are not a sign of economic health. And the fact of the matter is the UK economy, there were predictions made. As your report pointed out, people, when the austerity policies were launched, there were people in the UK government saying this will not be contractionary, everything will be fine. There were people like myself, like Martin Wolf, saying actually no, it won't. And guess what? It hasn't been okay. It's actually been as contractionary as the warning said.
But can you just explain?
Interest rates are low. This is a good thing, but the interest rates are low across every country that borrows in its own currency. That's not really an issue. And the point is that trying to be, of course, countries have to pay their debts, but a time when the economy is still very depressed, a time when there's massive excess capacity, when there just isn't enough private demand to keep the economy afloat, is not a good time to be trying to pay down your debts. It's a time when, in fact, the effort to pay down your debts is very likely actually self-defeating, even in purely fiscal terms, because you're contracting the economy, you're reducing revenue, and you're damaging the long run as well. Sustained weak economic performance is not good for long-run economic growth either. So
Matthew
those
Hancock,
kind of,
do you
I've been
accept...
describing it, and I will continue to describe it. What's happening in the UK...
Let me just bring in Matthew Hancock, Paul Krugman. Matthew, do you actually accept that austerity depresses growth, as the Office of Budgetary Responsibility made clear?
Yeah, I accept that austerity has a short-term impact on growth, which is what the
So it is
OBR
self-defeating
said.
in the short term, you accept that?
No, it's not. There's a difference between having an impact and having an impact that stops you dealing with your debts. We have been dealing with our debts. They're down. The deficit is down by a quarter. You have to do the deficit before you can get onto the debt, of course. But the argument that the really good unemployment numbers don't matter is inconsistent, Paul, with the argument that this will have a long-term impact, because the long-term impact mostly comes through the labour market. The labour market's been much better than anybody expected, and there are important reasons why the GDP figures have been tight, not least because we've been contracting the size of our financial sector. And, this whole debate has to take place within the context of the fact that we had the biggest banking bust, and at the same time, this massive structural deficit going into the crisis. And if we don't deal with it, things would be much worse.
Can you still hear us, Paul Krugman? I have a feeling we've lost the line. Can you hear us, Paul Krugman? Let me just try one last time. No, we'll try and re-establish that line. But let me just concentrate on what you were just saying now about accepting what the Office of Budget Responsibility corrected you on last week. Why did David Cameron come out with this extraordinary claim that the Office of Budgetary Responsibility were absolutely clear that the deficit reduction plan is not responsible, in fact, quite the opposite?
Yes.
Is he just economically illiterate?
No, he was clearly talking about the difference between the forecast of the OBR in 2010 and what has happened. He wasn't saying that there isn't an impact. We all know austerity is difficult. He was saying
so there is an impact on growth. So austerity means growth is less than
on the chart that you showed, the gap between the forecast by the OBR and the outturn by the OBR has been due to the Eurozone crisis, which we saw a debate about, and what happened in Greece, and Spain and Portugal. Also the higher oil prices and the decline in the North Sea, and also the fact we've got this massive banking crisis that still has an overhang on the economy. And fundamentally, we've got to deal with our debts. And there's only one person in Britain who agrees with Paul Krugman's analysis, and that's Ed Balls, who says that you need to borrow more to get out of debt. And I just don't see how it works.
Are you still also claiming that interest rates are low because of your successful policies and not because of the Bank of England's interventions?
In part, of course, QE is helpful. It's helpful to the economy, and things would be much worse otherwise. But, of course, also the fact that we have confidence that the government will pay its way in the world is a positive. It means that you can borrow from people for less. There's less risk on UK borrowing. So, of course, a part.
Let me just end by bringing back in Guy Verhofstadt, because what's interesting about this conversation is that you're on the same side. You agree with what Guy Verhofstadt is saying about European austerity, yes?
I even agree with him that it'd be good for the Eurozone countries to mutualise debt.
But you still blame Europe for Britain's recession?
I'm explaining that, in part, the difficulties in the Eurozone have had an impact on us. It's obvious because if you look at the export figures, for the first time in my life, and probably your life, we're now exporting more to the rest of the world than we are to the EU because it's been very difficult to export to the EU.
Mr Verhofstadt? How do you feel about being blamed for Britain's recession?
Well, there is clearly a recession in mostly every country of the European Union. Look, there are for the moment 7 countries in recession in the Eurozone. There are 9 countries who are facing economic stagnation in the Eurozone. That means a growth between 0 and 1%. And there is only one country, a small economy, Estonia, who is doing it well. And Britain is not better than the 17 countries of the Eurozone. So we have to change some policies. And the best thing we can do is to, next to fiscal discipline, because I agree, fiscal discipline is absolutely necessary to guarantee growth on the midterm and the long term. But you have to open a second track. And this second track is investment, is growth, is initiatives. And where can you find it? The only way to do it is certainly for countries in the south of Europe by lowering their interest rates. Because you have to know, and that's not the case in Britain for the moment, but these countries like Spain and Italy are still paying 5%, 6%, and from time to time even 7%.
I'm afraid.
A country like